Sometimes I worry that I'm not the hero everyone thinks I am. The philosophers assure me that this is the time, that the signs have been met. But I still wonder if they have the wrong man. So many people depend on me. They say I will hold the future of the entire world on my arms. What would they think if they knew that their champion, the hero of ages, their savior, doubted himself?
It was 1998, I think, when I first started thinking about Mistborn. I had just finished writing a book called Dragonsteel, which took place in a little more generic of a medieval world. Elantris before that had been a Renaissance world, and I was looking for something. I knew that I wanted a hallmark of my career to be distinctive settings. I've always felt that fantasy should be the most unique of all genres. But I had grown up reading a lot of wonderful books, don't get me wrong, that had pretty generic settings. They had felt trapped in this idea of a medieval European kingdom that just felt like it could have been from our world. And I wanted something that didn't feel like it could be our world, that if you walked outside, you saw a vista that just could not be from Earth. And that's where Mistborn came from. The road, the mist, the car, the mountains. So sometime in 1998, I was driving on the freeway, which is a great time actually for coming up with story ideas. When I'm driving, there's this sense of motion, a sense that my mind can drift a little bit. I obviously want to keep attention on the road, so I don't generally listen to audiobooks while I drive. I turn on music, and I do let my mind think a little bit about stories while I'm going. Some of the best time I've had for brainstorming is when I'm driving somewhere. Something about being on the road, something about passing landmarks. And I live in the American West. The landmarks are stunning out here. The vistas are gorgeous. And so there's always something great to look at, but there's not a lot of city in between the cities. I was driving between Utah and Idaho. I lived at the time in Provo, Utah, and my family all lived in Idaho Falls. So when I did these drives to go see my family, it's about a 4-hour drive. It was usually great time for thinking about my life, thinking about my goals, and, of course, thinking about my stories. One time during this drive, I hit a fog bank at about 70 miles an hour. When you're driving at that speed and you see the fog almost seems alive. You see variations in it much more strongly. You see it ebbing and flowing, and it feels like you're swimming through it, and it's a current. Rather than you moving, it feels like it's moving at times and sweeping around you. And that moment is when I came up with the idea for Mistborn. That moment's when I said, ooh, I love this visual. I love this feel. I love being in the fog and feeling like I don't know what's around the next corner. Fantasy is about immersion. Fantasy is about exploration. And I couldn't think of anything more invigorating than the idea of something familiar like a city being made instead into something strange and mysterious. I immediately started thinking of a story. Around the same time, I traveled to Washington, D.C. to visit some of my friends. And I had the opportunity to spend New Year's in 1999 on the National Mall. Several of my good friends in college had moved out there. In fact, one of them, Ryan, for whom Dre from Bridge 4 is named, had grown up in that area, Great Falls, Virginia. Once he'd graduated from college, he had gone back home for a little bit and invited me to come out and spend Y2K with him. We knew that the world wasn't actually going to end, but it was an amusing thing to consider. So I went out to see him. Our friend Annie also came out to see him. Annie is the inspiration in part for Serene from Elantris. And we went to see the sights. I had never actually been to Washington, D.C. before, and there is a lot to see. But I can remember being there at New Year's Eve on the mall, getting sprayed with champagne, listening to President Bill Clinton give a speech, and then riding home on the subway, still smelling of champagne and having had a wonderful experience despite being a little sodden at the time. One of the things we did when we were out there is we visited the National Cathedral. I love cathedrals. I love stained glass. And so we went and we did get there a little late at night, and they'd done this wonderful thing where they were shining lights onto the stained glass windows. So they seemed to glow as you were approaching. They were shining out into the night, these radiant, beautiful kaleidoscapes of color. And that image stuck with me. And I said, what if you were looking at these beautiful edifices and they were shining lights out the windows onto this swirling, writhing, alive mist that moved through the city? And that is what solidified the idea of what became the Noble Keeps in Mistborn. The setting for a lot of the story and the action takes place in buildings that were modeled after Gothic cathedrals. Why Gothic cathedrals for the nobility, though? Well, I was positing a world where religion was something different to these people. They had their god, the Lord Ruler, living among them. And I figured that having this echo of cathedrals, this religious symbol from our world, being something that had been co-opted by the nobility to live in and have parties in, really would get across this idea of religion being something very different to these people in a way that I don't want to say is necessarily corrupted, but at least occupied by a category of people who perhaps don't appreciate what they have. So what about the ash? The ash is the third real pillar of where Mistborn came from. This idea of a constant falling of ash. And I can point to a couple of different origins of this. One is loving the feeling of a snowfall. But I also had started to have this really interesting idea of a world where the hero had failed, where a team of people who had tried to save the world and had in some way failed. The standard story of a fantasy epic that I had read so many times was the history of this world, and I was looking for a symbol of that. Well, I figured that the idea of these giant volcanoes was one of the things that would just be super dramatic. I had studied the eruption of Mount St. Helens like a lot of young people had when I was in school, and that image of ash falling, the idea of Pompeii, where the ash came and then just didn't stop, had always stuck in my mind and been one of the strongest and most striking images from my schooling. So I thought maybe this is how it's going to look. After all, one of the inspirations for Mistborn is, what if Frodo had gotten all the way to Mordor, and Sauron had been waiting for him and taken the ring back. And I figured echoing the visuals of something like Mordor, echoing the visuals of a world where the Dark Lord won, what would it look like? This idea of something beautifully dangerous was that final piece. For me, a book is never one idea. A book is always an intersection of ideas. The idea of mist wasn't enough, but the idea of mist moving, mist outside, dynamic, powerful buildings full of glowing stained glass. The idea of mist at night and ash during the day, where the hero had failed and the Dark Lord had won, those ideas together are what mixed and became the brew that was eventually Mistborn. But every time I pass that stretch of road, I think, here's where a story began, and here's where imagination sparked.
Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson.